Well, good morning, everybody. We've come to the end of another week. Today we are in Romans chapter 15, which I mistakenly yesterday started reading the opening verses of. But Romans 15 is a chapter where Paul touches on several subject matters. He continues in the beginning of it discussing the weak and strong of faith, the different cultural traditions and all of that we talked about yesterday from chapter 14 about food laws and festivals and all of that. And he makes the point in verse 1 that we who are strong ought to bear the weakness of those without strength and not just please ourselves, that we need to have some patience with those whose faith is weaker and whose understanding is a little more legalistic. And in verse 2, he says, each of us is to please his neighbor for his good, to his edification, that each of us, which includes the strong and the weak, should focus on trying to edify one another. And so as I talked about yesterday, when the strong flaunts their freedom, that doesn't edify the weak. When the weak uses their rules like a sledgehammer on the strong, that doesn't edify anybody either. Both are wrong when they do that. So edify one another. In verses 5, 6, and 7, he talks about accepting one another and having the same mind, being of one mind in the sense of what we are about is bringing glory to and praising God. Now, he spends a good part of this chapter talking about his plans. He writes this near the end of his third missionary journey. He's on his way to Jerusalem. He had been collecting an offering for the poor, an offering for the saints in Jerusalem, collecting that from the Gentile churches in Greece and Macedonia. And we read about those in the book of Corinthians and elsewhere. Interestingly, Luke's account of Paul's journeys in the book of Acts does not mention this offering, but Paul talks about it in his letters. And so he says, I'm on my way to Jerusalem. And we read about that in the book of Acts. And he indicates that his plan is after he goes to Jerusalem and delivers that offering, he wants to go to Spain on to the west of Italy and Rome. And he on his way from Jerusalem to Spain, he wants to stop in Rome and spend some time with them. He's longed to do that for some time, but hasn't been able to. And he's hoping that they will financially support his ministry, his mission trip to plant churches in Spain. And that work was going to be more challenging than what he had done to date because there's very little historical evidence that there were large pockets of Jewish citizens in the cities of Spain the way they were in Italy and Greece and Galatia and northern Egypt and Syria and all of those places. So Paul was really wanting to step out in faith in a way that he had not done yet. That was his dream. Of course, we know from the book of Acts, he gets to Jerusalem and he's arrested. And then he spends the next few years in jail as he is transported from Jerusalem to Rome for trial. And the book of Acts ends with Paul under house arrest, if you will, in chains in Rome awaiting trial. That's how the book of Acts ends. Now, we can't say definitively what happened to Paul after that. There are little hints in his letters to Timothy and Titus and so on, and in some other ancient writings of the church that lead many, including myself, to believe that Paul, in all likelihood, was released from prison in Rome, did go to Spain. What he did there, we don't know. I mean, he would have planted churches, but we've got no record of it. And then also returned back to Rome and did some more ministry in the areas around there, but was eventually arrested again a second time and executed, martyred for the faith. When Nero, the nut job, the evil man, was the emperor of Rome. That's most likely, but we can't say that definitively, but that's most likely what happened to Paul. And he alludes to so much of this in Romans 15 and 16, but what spoke to me devotionally in this chapter is verse 18, when Paul is talking about his ministry among the Gentiles. That was God's call upon his life to take the gospel to the Gentiles, not to the Jews. He witnessed to Jews, but his calling, his passion was taking the gospel to the Gentiles. That's why he wants to go to Spain. And in verse 18, he says, "For I will not presume to speak of anything except what Christ has accomplished through me, resulting in the obedience of the Gentiles by word and deed." And what jumped out at me was Paul says that these Gentiles who became followers of Jesus, who were saved, who became believers, were obedient to God by word and deed. In word or act, in word and profession, in what they claimed, what they said, and in deed, in their behavior, in their actions. In other words, their behavior, their actions supported what they claimed. They claimed to be followers of Jesus. In word, they professed that. They made a profession of faith, and he says the way they lived, what they did actually backed it up. The old saying, the proof is in the pudding. Or we sometimes say, he lives what he preaches. She practices, she does what she teaches. That's the same idea here, that Paul says these Gentiles who became believers in Jesus, they backed up what they claimed to be. They said we're followers of Jesus, and their lives backed it up. That should be true of all of us, of me and you. And while believers will always be persecuted by some people in certain circumstances throughout time, the truth is, in America, we've got too many people who go to church. And candidly, we've got too many people in the pulpit whose lives don't match what they say. And the world watches and knows it. And it hinders the gospel. It brings shame on the gospel, on the church, and on Jesus Christ. Now, let me say something. It's not in the text, but it's biblically true. If your life doesn't match what you claim, you're going to have to explain that to Jesus on the judgment day. And that's not something you want to have to do. That's the sermon for today. I'll see you Sunday morning with another sermon, and then Monday with another devotion as we wrap up the book of Romans, chapter 16. God bless you.